I'm joined now by our panel, NBR senior journalist Maria Slade, AUT Associate Professor Dr Ella Henry and former National Staffer, now working in PR, Ben Thomas, Tēnā koutou. Thanks for your time. Like hate speech, let's talk about that. Like Chris Wilson's interview there said there are unprecedented levels and it's spilling over to the real world. But this is really tricky, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah,
tricky for the government to do this.
Yeah, look, people are getting crazier and worse. There's no arguing that. That's, denying that reality is not the reason to not proceed with hate speech laws. The reason to be very, very cautious is that there is potential for massive overreach. There is so much vagueness about what will be used, what would qualify as inciting hatred. What we desperately want to avoid is situations overseas where we've seen basically social media trends become enforceable police matters.
So that balance, though, Ella, very tricky. And I think Chris Wilson said, good on the government for trying to do it. But the problem that we had last time was that it was so vague that they had to come back and have another go at it.
I do think consultation is important, but recently I've raised the ire of a group of people because I dared to suggest that Professor Richard Dawkins might be inaccurate in his assumption that Mātou Rangamāori is myth rather than science. And I made a comment and as I said, raised the ire of a significant number of people. What was interesting...
So you're saying you got a lot of hate, right?
Teeny tiny little doses of hate.
Online?
Online, obviously. And so I do get a sense that this is a real and tangible thing if you happen to be the victim of people expressing that anger you spoke of, Ben. But I think also that consultation is going to be a critical component moving forward. We can't act quickly on this because it's about transforming society.
There's a couple of things here. I mean, one, some people believe that the existing legislation already prohibits harassment and incitement, and now Ardern's saying she wants consensus, and National Maria is saying, well, we don't actually think they're necessary. So is there a way forward?
I think one of Kiri Allen's biggest challenges is going to be communicating exactly what it is the government wants to do. I mean, it all went badly wrong when Chris Whāwhoi was overseeing it, and there was that whole discussion about if you called someone a Karen, could you possibly be caught under the new legislation? And he sort of prevaricated and said, well, maybe. And then that brings in all your free speech sort of brigade and the overreach that Ben is discussing. Yeah. So
and the overreach could lead to a backlash. I mean, Chris Wilson was also talking about that as well.
Yes. And so we haven't really seen enough detail of exactly what it is they want to do. But when you think about the fact that the current legislation doesn't cover religion, doesn't cover gender, doesn't cover, sexual orientation, that would seem to me, as an ordinary New Zealander, to be quite an oversight.
And that could be where they're going with this legislation. We'll have to wait and see until the details come out next week. Let's talk Jacinda Ardern. She's off to the East Asia Summit and then APEC. She has been out of the country a lot. Has it been worthwhile for New Zealand taxpayer?
Of course. She's the Prime Minister. She is without a doubt the #1 and the best ambassador for New Zealand to the world. You wouldn't be wanting to send subordinates. She's the franchise. This is her job as Prime Minister. As she said in her interview, our regional interests are very unsettled right now. The areas where we traditionally operate, the things that we depend on, which is a rules-based world order, are under more threat than ever before. It's absolutely proper. I think 8 weeks is a small investment.
It's a small investment. The one thing that could happen, Ella, is that she could meet President Xi over there. That'd be an interesting conversation.
Well, we've obviously had some trouble in recent months in terms of the perceptions of Australia, New Zealand and China, so it'd be great, I think, if they are able to sit down eye to eye and have a conversation. But to echo Ben's sentiments, I think it's really critical, the mana that she brings to these gatherings as our Prime Minister and how well regarded she is.
Does that mana translate to dollars, Maria?
Well, she has made the comment herself that with the cost of living crisis that so many countries are now experiencing, protectionism is now becoming a thing, and which would be bad news for a country like New Zealand, who's a major food exporter. So we definitely need her out there banging the drum. And she is the star. Look, I heard a story just recently of a business mission to New York occurred just when the Queen died. So the Prime Minister was supposed to attend all these events but had to go to London. They had all this media lined up. They all pulled pulled out when Jacinda wasn't going to be there because she's the star of the show.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the polls this week, Ben. Jacinda Ardern was saying the Newshub Reid research poll, which showed Labor had gone down to 32%. She's saying, I'm taking that with a grain of salt. Should she?
Yeah, look, fair enough in this case. They said their internal polling didn't line up. There was a taxpayer union poll later this week, which showed things a bit closer. We've reached a bit of a holding pattern where National and ACT are nudging ahead of Labor and the Greens.
Yep.
Certainly won't be comforting for the government. They'll be really looking to kind of break out of the sort of troubles that they've had, really get some kind of focus on cost of living, which is by far the most important issue to voters.
It seems to be the only phrase that Jacinda Ardern is uttering at the moment is cost of living. Yeah, I just wonder whether, Maria, that Chris Luxon should be thinking I should be a little bit further ahead than I am, given the current economic situation.
Yeah, I could see that they would be frustrated. The polls have been consistent in recent times. The National ACT, however you want to put the pairing together, they're just inching forward and inching forward. But that doesn't seem to translate to Chris Luxon's popularity. I don't know what he needs to do. I think he just needs to, get a bit more forceful somehow. Just kind of say a few more interesting things. Just be a bit out there. I mean, the Prime Minister...
Do you think he's a bit bland?
A bit bland, maybe.
Bit bland.
The Prime Minister is very clever at this game of politics, and Chris is he's in chief executive mode, shall we say.
So, Ella, what would Chris Luxon have to do to go from chief executive to potential Prime Minister?
I mean, the reality is he is what he is. He's a white man who projects a very specific image of a certain age. And the reality is our electorate, our constituency is getting younger. So if you cannot find a way to speak to that generation, which I think Jacinda does very well because she's part of it, then maybe he needs to bring in the team that helped, transform previous Prime Ministers from being more bland characters.
I think at the same time, he shot up to very, pretty high preferred PM rating for an opposition leader. Traditionally, the opposition leader will be sort of magnitudes lower than the Prime Minister just because publicity, status quo bias. But in the election year, there'll be much more focus on the two of them. Now, that will be what Labor is counting on, that Jacinda will be able to, Ardern will be able to pull clear of Luxon in a two-horse race.
Yep.
Luxon will think, well, I'll be getting the same kind of level of media attention. Actually, that will, as it tends to do, improve my standing in the preferred PM ratings.
Right, OK. So hanging on for next year. There's a couple of things that Labor is trying to get out of the way before next year. And we're going to talk Three Waters. Ben, I can't talk to you because you've got a conflict of interest. But Maria, I mean, Kieran McAnulty has been out there trying to woo the councils. Three Waters has changed a little bit, but they haven't done anything about the co-governance issue and they've given rural councils more of a say. Is that going to woo the rural constituency back to Labor?
I would have to say no. They hate it. They really do. And I think the changes that were announced yesterday are nowhere near enough. Rightly or wrongly, the co-governance idea is just not washing with that rural heartland, if you like, and the government is hell-bent on it. They are ideological, and look, we all agree there needs to be water reform, definitely, but they are going for the Rolls-Royce solution, and you do wonder if there couldn't be some more practical structures that they could bring into place that would achieve a lot of things and get it across the line.
Ella, I've noticed that the government has steered away from the phrase in recent conversations about it. What do you think about that? I mean, it's still there in the proposed legislation, but they are not using it in terms of their language.
I'm Māori, so I have a vested interest in the whole notion of co-governance because I think this country as a nation was formed on the idea of co-governance. That's what Te Tiriti spoke about. And there are a number of examples of it working very effectively. Crown Forestry Rental Trust, the racing industry working with government has its own minister. I worry that the reason people fear co-governance is because there is an underlying fear still of Māori, and that saddens me a great deal because unless we can work out how to operate more effectively together, the future begins to look bleaker for all those angry people out there.
Back to hate speech, which we'll have more on next week. Thank you so much to our panel, Maria Slade, Ella Henry and Ben Thomas.